Welcome, class, to the lecture Cognitive Development for Unit 4. This lecture will take us through cognitive development. What does it mean? And two theorists, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky's theories of cognitive development. It will also discuss some defining characteristics of adolescent cognitive development. Let's begin by thinking about childhood development, and we'll begin with a painting from the 18th century. Study the painting. What jumps out at you? What strikes you about this painting? Do you notice anything unusual? Well, you might notice that these are children, but they're dressed like miniature adults. They're dressed in dresses, and actually one of these is a boy. The one on the left is a boy, and boys were often dressed in girls' dresses until they were older. You might also notice the boy on the left is holding a squirrel. You might notice that the proportions seem wrong of the children. For example, generally, children's heads are larger than adults' heads in relation to the rest of their bodies. Yet these heads are drawn as if they were adults. The reason I'm bringing up this painting is because of the way childhood and children were viewed up until recently. It used to be that we viewed childhood and children as miniature adults, and so that is why the children in this painting were depicted almost as miniature adults. Nowadays, of course, we know that children are not miniature adults, that children think differently and see the world differently than adults do. It doesn't take spending a lot of time around children in a classroom before you realize that. One of the first requirements of effective teaching is that you understand how students think and how they view the world, which is very different than how you think and view the world. Effective teaching strategies must take into account students' ages and stages of development. Let's begin by thinking about how do children develop cognitively. First, we need to understand what does develop mean. The term development refers to how people grow, adapt, and change over the course of their lifetimes. The term includes three types of development that we will cover in this course. There are, of course, other types of development, but we will focus primarily on cognitive development, social emotional development, and moral development. Cognitive refers to mental abilities. So when we develop cognitively, our thinking and our reasoning abilities grow more advanced. Cognitive refers to mental or thinking abilities. You might have heard the term nature versus nurture, and that term comes into play here. I want to ask you a question. Is development predetermined at birth by heredity and biological factors, or is it affected by experience and other environmental factors? You might have noticed that if you're a sibling, you and your sister or brother might share certain common characteristics or traits. For example, you might be able to wink the same eye. You might resemble each other. Your hair might be the same color. Or you might exhibit certain behavioral characteristics, a way of talking, a way of gesturing that is similar. It's hard when you live in a home with a brother or sister to know if those similarities come from nature or genetics, the fact that you share parents, or nurture, or the experiences that have led you to become who you are. However, twin studies have been done that suggest an answer. First, let's understand what a twin study is. Identical twins share exactly the same DNA, which is why they look alike. It would be unethical to separate identical twins and raise them in different environments for the purposes of studying them and how they turn out. But scientists have tracked down twins that were separated at birth. These are always identical twins. And by studying the identical twins who were separated at birth, you can begin to understand the influence of nature versus the influence of nurture. Because identical twins share DNA, the nature is the same for each of them. But because they were raised in different environments, the nurture is different. What scientists have found is that both factors, nature and nurture, are responsible for how we turn out. However, twin studies suggest that nature or genetics might have a little bit more to do with how you turn out than nurture. Let's turn to our first theorist, Jean Piaget, who lived from 1896 to 1980. You've probably heard his name if you're in education. He was one of the most prominent and important educational psychologist researchers in the 20th century. He was born in Switzerland. He was a Swiss developmental psychologist. He was known for developing a biological model of intellectual development during the early 20th century. We call this model Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Basically, Piaget believed that all children are born with an innate tendency to interact with and make sense of their environments. So, for example, think of a baby starting to crawl. The baby will crawl all over the place, exploring his or her environment, learning as they go. Piaget further developed the idea of schemes, which he said young children demonstrate patterns of behavior or thinking called schemes that older children and adults also use in dealing with objects in the world. So a baby might come across a rattle, for example, for the first time, pick it up, shake it, put it in its mouth, thump it on the floor. And in doing all of that, the baby is developing a scheme about what a rattle is. As we grow, we make more and more schemes, and we make more and more connections between objects. So our mental schemes grow more complex and more abstract. We use these schemes to explore and act upon the world. Out of Piaget's theory grew a way of teaching called constructivism that we'll study later in the semester. Constructivism means that children construct meaning and understand reality through their experience and interactions. Teachers who follow this idea of teaching act as a guide on the side as opposed to a sage on the stage. In other words, a teacher who uses constructivism in her classroom is setting up activities that allow students to explore their environment and construct much of their own learning. Many classrooms use constructivism. You might know of a school type known as Montessori. Montessori is a well-known model for the use of constructivism. Let's talk a bit more about Piaget. Piaget believed that learners progress through 4 sequential stages of development. These stages are sensorimotor from about birth to 2 years old, preoperational from about 3 to 6 years, concrete operational from about 7 to 11 years, and formal operational from about 12 years to adulthood. It's important to be aware that these ages are not set in stone. Some children progress through the stages faster and some slower. Let's take a look at each individual stage. Sensorimotor stage occurs from about birth to age 2. This is called sensorimotor because this stage, babies and young children explore the world by using their senses and their motor skills. They're crawling around, they're putting things in their mouth, they're exploring their environments. Dramatic changes occur as infants progress through this stage. Initially, all infants have inborn behaviors called reflexes. So, an infant is born with a limited number of capabilities. He can cry, he can suck or eat, and he can move or startle. These are some of the inborn abilities that babies are born with. These are called reflexes. Infants use these reflexes to produce more interesting and intentional patterns of behaviors. For example, an infant cries and the mother goes to pick the infant up. The infant learns that crying brings mother, so the infant may cry more. The behavior is no longer a reflex that the child cries because he's startled. The child learns to cry because he wants something. Sensorimotor also includes a lack of a trait called object permanence. Object permanence is the understanding that an object exists even if it's out of sight. Babies at this stage do not exhibit object permanence. If you've ever played peekaboo with a baby, you'll see the baby laugh when you go behind your hands or hide behind a cloth. The baby suddenly laughs when you reappear because he thinks you have disappeared and now suddenly you're back. Older children start to develop object permanence, so they realize that even if an object disappears, it is not gone. It is just hiding. During the preoperational stage, children have a greater ability to think about things and can use symbols to mentally represent objects, but they still lack certain attributes. One of Piaget's most important discoveries is that young children lack an understanding of the principles of conservation and centration. Conservation is the concept that certain properties of an object, such as weight, remain the same regardless of a change in other properties, such as length. So, for example, if you give the child a balloon filled with sand, and you ask the child to weigh the balloon, and you see that it weighs a pound, and then you squeeze the balloon so it's a different shape, and ask the child if it still weighs the same thing, the child might answer no, because they weren't able to conserve the idea that weight doesn't change. Centration, on the other hand, is the tendency to pay attention to only one aspect of an object or situation. This is why preschool children, have trouble sorting objects by more than one characteristic. Suppose you give a preschool child blocks that are different shapes and colors. Maybe the blocks are triangles, circles, and squares. You can say to the child, sort the block by color, and they'll put all the green blocks, all the blue blocks together, and all the orange blocks together. You might even be able to have them sort them by shape, squares all together, triangles all together, and circles all together. But if you say to the child, put all of the blue squares together, put all of the blue rectangles together, they could have trouble sorting by that. That's because they can only center on one characteristic at a time. Preoperational children also do not demonstrate reversibility, or the ability to abstractly reverse an operation in one's mind. So this is why you can't, for example, do complicated addition with children at this age and expect them to understand that it's related to subtraction. Preoperational children are egocentric in their thinking. Children at this stage believe that everyone literally physically sees the world exactly as they do. So, for example, if you sit a child in a chair and you show him one side of a two-sided diorama, and then you turn it so that it faces you, and then the child is actually looking at the other side, he cannot describe what he just saw. He cannot remember or represent. He can only describe what's in front of him. Children from ages 7 to 11 enter what's called the concrete operational stage. Although the differences between the mental abilities of preoperational preschoolers and concrete operational elementary school students are dramatic, concrete operational children still do not think like adults. These are children in middle to late elementary school, sometimes early middle school. At this stage, children develop the capacity for logical reasoning and a limited understanding of conservation in familiar situations. They're still not able to handle abstract reasoning very well, and they often require manipulatives to bridge between that logical thinking between where they were preoperationally and where they're trying to get to reason abstractly. Children develop what's called inferred reality at this stage, or the ability to see things in the context of other meanings. Our text gives the example of showing a picture of a red car covering the car with black film. A child who has mastered inferred reality knows that even though the car looks black, it is still red. He can infer that. One important task that children learn during the concrete operational stage is seriation, or arranging things in a logical progression, for example, from smallest to largest. Once this ability is acquired, children can master a related skill known as transitivity, which is a skill in which individuals can mentally arrange and compare objects. So the old math principle of transitivity, A equals B equals C, children in late elementary school begin to develop the ability to think and reason this through. This has to do somewhat with the idea that preoperational children lack the idea of reversibility. They can't go backwards, C equals B equals A. But sometime around 4th or 5th grade, that clicks in and children are able to reason that through, particularly with manipulatives. By the end of this stage, children have the mental abilities to learn how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, place numbers in order by size, and to classify objects by any number of criteria. The last stage is known as the formal operational stage. Children enter that at age 11 or 12, and it progresses through adulthood. This occurs middle of middle school and goes through adulthood, high school. Sometime around the onset of puberty, children's thinking begins to develop into the form that is characteristic of that of adults. The pre-adolescent begins to think more abstractly and to see possibilities beyond the here and now. These abilities continue to develop into adulthood. With the formal operational stage comes the ability or potential for hypothetical situations. The form is now separate from the context. So, for example, you might see children at this stage really begin to understand the scientific process, to be able to develop a hypothesis and to be able to support claims with evidence. Another ability that Piaget recognized in the young adolescent is the ability to reason about situations and conditions that have not been experienced. So if you're teaching literature, this is a good stage to begin to talk about stories that have little or nothing to do with the student's own experiences. Prior to that, it's hard for students to grasp the inferred reality of those situations. Lev Vygotsky is another prominent educational theorist. He lived from 1897 to 1934. He was a Russian psychologist who developed a more cultural view of cognitive development. He built on the works of Jean Piaget, but unlike Piaget, he believed that learning precedes development. Vygotsky theorized that learning can precede development, which was a change from Piaget. You'll remember Piaget said development comes and then learning can occur. But Vygotsky actually said, wait, if we expose children to certain experiences, they can learn from them. For example, suppose parents of a baby teach that whenever they are leaving a group of people, it is good to wave bye-bye. The baby will come to associate the hand signal that means bye-bye with people leaving. The baby has been taught a sign. How does this happen? Well, first, the parents may naturally demonstrate the sign to the baby, waving to their friends as they leave. And the baby may notice that their parents only do it when people are leaving. Next, there will be a stage where the baby only does it with the parent, and then the baby will learn to associate the sign with people leaving and do it on his own. The baby has been taught the sign. So for Vygotsky, learning involves the acquisition of signs by means of information from others and deliberate teaching. He believed that development occurs as the child internalizes all of these signs so as to be able to think and solve problems without the help of others. This is an ability called self-regulation. The first step in the development of self-regulation and independent thinking is learning that actions and sounds have meaning. Now, several very important concepts are associated with Vygotsky. One that you'll hear referred to in this course throughout the course is called the zone of proximal development. This is a term that describes tasks that a child cannot yet accomplish alone, but could accomplish with the assistance of more competent peers or adults. If the task is too easy, it may not be appropriate because it's not challenging. The child won't learn anything. If the task is too difficult, it's overwhelming, and so the student may shut down. Scaffolding is that assistance provided by more competent peers or adults. You might have been walking by a building and seen scaffolding like in the picture here. This scaffolding supports workers as they repair the building, as they paint the building, and as they clean windows. Similarly, we talk about educational scaffolding is that support that students need in order to learn something. In a zone of proximal development, you would think of learning like a ladder. If you have a student at the very bottom, the student can't jump to the tallest rung of the highest rung of the ladder without going through several rungs first. The next rung, the second rung, and then the third rung, and then the fourth rung, etc. The scaffolding is the teaching or support that the teacher or competent peers offer to the student to get him or her to the next rung. Because Vygotsky focused on zone of proximal development as scaffolding, he thought cooperative learning was extremely important. Children work together to help each other learn. Let's put some of these ideas together. And because this is an adolescent psychology course, focus on the defining characteristics of adolescent cognitive development. We know that many adolescents are entering the formal operational stage and exhibit a beginning ability to think about abstract ideas. They're not always very good at it yet. They're still learning. So your job as a teacher is to provide those experiences to help them think more abstractly. However, you must remember that some students in your classroom will still be in the concrete operational stage and are not yet able to reason abstractly. They may require more scaffolding, breaking down the task into simpler steps, less of a focus on abstract reasoning. Adolescent egocentrism is the idea that adolescents focus on their self to the exclusion of others. Sometimes they believe they are more unique than others. The results of this are startling at times. For example, they may have difficulty imagining someone else's perspective. They may seem very selfish in this way. They may demonstrate an increased sensitivity. They may think everything is about them. They may constantly believe that people are talking about them or the focus is on them. They may believe that they possess some special secret ability or trait. I often think this is one of the reasons that the book series Harry Potter was so popular. Think about it. It was about a young adolescent boy who believed who became a wizard. Adolescent egocentrism differs from a young child's egocentrism because an adolescent understands and can test reality. You'll recall that children in the preoperational stage were also very egocentric. They couldn't take another's viewpoint, for example. But again, the difference here is that adolescents are more able to reason things through. Adolescents may exhibit an invincibility fable, which is the belief of some adolescents they are immune from common dangers. We'll learn about some of the dangers of adolescence in this course, including drug use, alcohol use. The invincibility fable, when combined with certain destructive behaviors, results sometimes in tragic outcomes. Students die, students commit suicide, students damage their lives, sometimes forever, because of this belief system. Why does all of this matter to teachers? Why is it important for you to understand adolescents' cognitive development? You must understand your students' levels of ability in order to be an effective teacher. Asking a student to complete a task he or she is incapable of doing is unethical and frustrating for you and the students. Frequently, you can advance students' cognitive abilities by providing attainable challenge. So, in a nutshell, it helps you to target appropriate instruction and to understand students' levels better. Here's a summary of this lecture. Children used to be viewed as miniature adults. Now we know that children are qualitatively different from adults in terms of stages of development. Jean Piaget developed a theory of cognitive development that viewed development as occurring in 4 sequential stages. Lev Vygotsky built on Piaget's works and developed a model that theorized that learning precedes development. A student's zone of proximal development, or ZPD, is the level at which a student can learn with scaffolding from a competent peer or adult. Teachers should understand levels of development because it helps them understand students' abilities and target instruction. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.